I'm glad to be with you on a Saturday morning. We're trying a different time for today's gathering, just to kind of see uh, what meets people's needs and invite some conversation. So as we get started, I'm going to give an opening prayer, and then we're going to do some introductions around so we can see who all is with us. And then we'll move into the topic of the day around the actions of the General Assembly linking up with the church. So let us open with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for gathering us as your people, but especially for gathering this group to learn more about how you are at work in your church and to learn more about each other and how we can walk together. We hold before you the people of our land who have faced unimaginable tragedy in recent days, the people of Florida and South Carolina, as they wonder and wander through the days after Hurricane Ian. We hold before you the people of Puerto Rico as they too find their way after these same storms came through. And we hold before you all who are looking for your presence in our weary world. Not only do we hold them before you this day, but we ask you to help us to know how we can walk beside them and hold them in our arms as well, that we might be your hands and feet in this weary world. Now send your spirit upon our conversation. Open our eyes and ears and mouths so that we might know how you are working in this time and place. Through Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen. Well, it is a joy to be with you once again for the second in our series of conversations with the clerk. As I mentioned today, we're going to be looking at the actions of the General Assembly this past summer, that are addressing the particular situations of the church. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But before we get to that, I just want to invite everyone to take a moment to introduce yourselves. And very briefly, just in a minute or less, tell us your name and how you are connected to the presbytery, what congregation you're a part of, or if you're a minister, that sort of thing. What brought you to today's gathering, what your interest was. And because I will tell you, I am joining from North Carolina, and where I have felt the very personal, I'm on my way to the beach for a week of continuing education and reading time. But I've also felt very personally the effects of Hurricane Ian the last 36 hours or so. So because I have not been able to do this, I want to know from each of you, what is your favorite way to hunker down when there is a storm passing by? What gives you comfort and peace? And you can assume that the power is on, if that is a necessary assumption. As in my case, it would be last night. I'm actually very lucky to be with you, because I was concerned at 10 p.m. last night when there was no power. So we are back with you. So your name, congregation, or connection, what interests you in today's gathering, and your favorite way to hunker down during a storm. So Chip, you're in my upper left. I know who you are, but I want to hear all the rest of these. So
I'm Chip Blankenship. I'm a minister member of the Presbytery, and currently its Director of Operations. I'm one of the congregational consultants. I attend, when I'm not working in another church, I attend Central Presbyterian Church, where my wife is a member. And I'm actually in a hotel room in Knoxville, Tennessee at the moment, on my way back to Atlanta. And my favorite way to hunker down is just to tuck in with a good book and take the quiet time while it's available.
Great. Thanks, Chip. I will just call on folks on my screen to make this work. So Cheryl.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Hartman. I am a ruling elder. I am a member of Good Shepherd Presbyterian Church and work at Oakhurst Presbyterian Church, right there with Mary Smar. And I was also one of the delegates to General Assembly this past year, served on the polity committee, which was great fun. And my favorite way to hunker down is actually live on a small farm between Snellville and Lilburn. And my parents built this room that has a glass corner that overlooks the pasture. And I love just to sit in the recliner there and stare out at the storm and watch the majesty of God.
Wow, thanks. Karen, you're next on my screen.
Hi, I'm Karen, excuse me, Karen Turney. I'm a member at Covenant Presbyterian Church, and I also belong to the Peace and Global Witness Partnership for the Presbytery. So I stay fairly close with that. I have been to numerous GAs, so I'm always interested about what's going on. And since I'm clerk for the session at my church currently, I try to keep them somewhat informed about what's coming from GA that we will have to vote on at some point. And my favorite thing to do is work on quilting stuff. So here's my my current project is a dinosaur themed item. I think it'll turn into a small blanket. So for a young person. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Karen. Betty, you're next on my screen. I think you'll have to unmute, Betty.
Betty Dora, ruling elder, Radcliffe Church. And I hunker down by sleeping. And just like an hour ago, the lights went out briefly, but when my lights go out, my computer, my television, and everything else will go out. I like to keep up with what's going on at General Assembly, having attended 34 consecutive assemblies, and would have been attending more had some other things not happened.
Wow, thanks, Betty. Yeah, I'll tell you a little more about my first assembly in a few minutes, but yeah, that's an impressive run. So, Alex, you're next on my screen.
All right, good morning. I am the pastor at Timber Ridge Presbyterian Church in McDonough, and I am joining you today from my mother's kitchen in Texas. She just had her knee replaced, so I am here to help. So if I vanish for a moment or two, I will rejoin when I'm able. I am here because I wasn't able to attend the first, and I think as a couple others have said, you know, the things that we're going to be voting on, it feels good to have some clarity on that, to be able to help our elders and other presbytery commissioners kind of understand what's coming. So I'm grateful to be with you all today. I think my favorite way to hunker down, if I have power, I mean, books, crosswords, and movies. I think that's how I would do it in some order.
Thanks. Francis.
Yes, thank you. My name is Francis Githier. I'm a pastor of a new church development that meets at Stockbridge Presbyterian, which is on the southern side. About 2 years ago, I was commissioner to the General Assembly, and we did that via Zoom. And I'm interested in what goes on within our denomination. In terms of anchoring down, I usually do that by reading books and also writing whenever possible, if I have hour. And I'm also joining you this morning from my home here in Stockbridge.
Thanks, Francis. Joy.
I am Joy Fisher. I'm on the staff of the Presbytery as a congregational consultant. I think I know most of you, and part of why I'm here is I enjoy seeing our ruling elders and teaching elders on a Saturday morning. It's just fun to see who's all that jazzed by Presbytery. So it's good to see your faces and your interest. Also, I missed GA this year, and typically I rely on the stated clerk to let me know what I need to know about GA, and so I appreciate you making this opportunity available, Andy, and I always enjoy conversations with Andy.
Thanks.
And when I hunkered down, board games would be my first choice. My husband doesn't like board games, so now that my children are grown, it's not always possible. So yeah, then it's just if the power's on, then video games or movies. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Joy. Mary.
Good morning. I'm Mary Smart, elder. I'm ruling elder at Oakhurst Presbyterian Church. I'm also currently clerk of session there. And my interest, I like to keep up with what's going on. I was a commissioner to General Assembly a few years, well, I guess it was 2018. And so I just want to keep track of what's going on in the broader church. I hunker down, I guess, by listening to music. I like to listen to music and just relax and make sure that I have warm feet and hot tea, sometimes a glass of wine. But those are things that relaxes me.
Great. Thanks, Mary. Catherine, we don't see your face, but I think you may be able to hear and speak to us.
I can hear you, and I'm trying to speak to you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I am a member and clerk of session at Austell, which is about 18 miles west of Atlanta. I'm joining your meeting to be better informed for myself and my session. And the thing I like to do, I can't remember hunkering down when there wasn't snow on the ground. So usually I'm seated before the fireplace, enjoying the fire with a cup of coffee or hot chocolate. And then later maybe read.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. I will give you a quick and a little longer introduction of myself. But so, as I mentioned, I'm Andy James. I'm the stated clerk of the Presbytery. I'm interested in General Assembly for a lot of reasons. I attended my first General Assembly in 1998. The assembly was in Charlotte that year. I was a volunteer in the Office of Communications, and have a very vivid memory of walking in the convention center and being put to work making network cables, and dove right into technology work. This was a day and age when they had a computer lab at General Assembly, and the internet connection at the General Assembly consisted of a special box that had you could connect all these computers to with wires, and then it connected to the internet via two 56K modems. So it was a very, Zoom would never have survived on such a connection. Even the audio would have been iffy. But so that was my first assembly experience, but the bug bit me. I've been to a total of 11 General Assemblies now in a variety of roles. I've been a volunteer, as I mentioned, an observer. I was a youth advisory delegate when they were still called youth advisory delegates. I've been as a Presbytery stated clerk. I've served as a parliamentarian on the floor, the plenary floor, and in committees. And I'm currently a member of the Committee on the Office of the General Assembly. So the last couple of assemblies, I guess since 2018, I've served as a corresponding member of the Assembly. So, but a little bit about my story for those of you who haven't heard it. I am not one who, the hunkering down has become an interesting piece of my life. In recent years, living in North Carolina, facing a few hurricanes. So, and I tend to enjoy, I'm a crossword fan. Last night, even when the power was out, I was able to dig up the crossword, had just enough cell service to grab the crossword from the internet and do it, and just enough power left to get through it. So that's how I would do that. But then also so I came to Atlanta from North Carolina, where I served on the staff in New Hope Presbytery, which is the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area, eastward to the coast. There I was not the stated clerk, I was the associate for small church ministries and technology. Before that, I was in New York City as a small church pastor for 11 years. And I also served as stated clerk of the Presbytery of New York City. But I went to seminary at Columbia in Decatur and was born and baptized Presbyterian in Mississippi. So in all those places, I've had a few opportunities to hunker down. New York, it was usually snowstorms, although there were a couple hurricanes there as well. North Carolina, it was much more often the hurricanes. And now grateful that maybe we'll have a little bit less of that in Atlanta in my time with you all. So as we turn to this year's General Assembly, just a couple of important facts and figures. There are 465 commissioners and 96 advisory delegates to this year's assembly. If you're unfamiliar with how the assembly met, this was a hybrid General Assembly, not in the sense of most of it was not a true hybrid meeting with some people gathered in person and others online, but it was a mix of meeting styles. The committee meetings were held in person in Louisville, and then the plenaries were held online via Zoom, with the exception of the opening plenaries where the group who were gathered for the first set of committees actually did gather in person because of some pretty technical reasons, but some parliamentary reasons more than anything, requiring an in-person quorum to convene the assembly. And the first action they took was to establish a special rule to open the meeting up to those who were gathered by Zoom. This assembly, the 225th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA, the first one, 1789. This one dealt with had about 150 items of business to deal with, maybe a little more than that, in large part because there were a number of items that were carried over from the 2020 assembly that were left to be done. And on top of that, technically, I think the second item of business for this assembly, I mentioned the first to open the meeting. The second item of business was to ratify everything that had been done at the previous assembly, because it was not actually official due to the strict interpretation of parliamentary procedure that says an electronic meeting space has to be officially authorized. So, there was a good bit to be done out of 2020, and we're grateful for all the ways in which everyone who served, and I think we've got commissioners from 2020 and 2022 on our call today. So I want to particularly thank you all for your flexibility in that, on behalf of folks who have been a part of the planning for this, but also just the whole church is so grateful for your willingness to wander this way in a leading way for us. So I'm going to try to pause and see if there are any questions as we go along the way, but please feel free to stop me, just unmute yourself and speak up. Probably the easiest way to do it. You can drop a question in the chat if you like, but probably the easiest thing to do, as I said, is just interrupt me. We're a small enough group. We are recording this, so I know that others will be watching later, but we're a small enough group that it's okay if you stop and ask a question along the way. So just a couple of general comments about the General Assembly that I think are important to remember when we start thinking about it, that the General Assembly speaks ultimately for itself. It's not trying to speak for the whole church or for every Presbyterian. So there's naturally going to be some disconnect between the church in its expression at the General Assembly and the church expressed in our presbytery or in our congregations. And so some have asked the question, why should the assembly speak at all? And I think it's a good one. But I'm convinced personally, at least, and I think those who have followed the assembly for years and those who lead it, and many of those who serve in it, are convinced that the assembly needs to speak at least some of the time, because there's a connection between our words and our actions. This will be one of the times I quote the Book of Order to you. In the Foundations of Presbyterian Polity, the first section of the Book of Order, F3 0104, talks about how truth is in order to goodness. And the easiest way, it's a confusing paragraph. It's written in the language of the 18th century, and it bounces back and forth and all around. But when I read this, I am reminded that our words inform our actions, and our actions inform our words. So the assembly is an important part of speaking so that we can know how to act. The other thing that matters about the assembly speaking, or one of the other things that matters, is that the assembly is building on relationships. Almost all of the items of business for the assembly are coming out of relationships themselves. They come from presbyteries as overtures, or from national committees that have been implementing past actions that were usually sent by presbyteries that now need some further instruction. So there's this sense of the assembly is always doing things in relationship. One of the unique things about the way that the assembly manages its business is that they are insistent that every communication to it receives some sort of response, whether it be answered with a no or a yes, or we're doing this in some other way. Every item of business needs some sort of action. And that's a unique thing. In our presbytery, we could potentially leave things undone, but in the General Assembly, they are very particular in the planning and operation of it, that everything gets a response. And in addition, there is this importance for the assembly that the actions of the General Assembly are there to guide the rest of the church in our work. It's not meant necessarily to stand over and against the rest of the church, but it's designed to amplify the work that's happening in our congregations and to challenge us to expand our vision and invite us to deeper understanding together. Along that way, that we know that we're going to disagree. God alone is Lord of our conscience, and we are called to forbear mutually with one another as we find our way through that. And when I was preparing for these gatherings, I've been through most of the actions, and I went back, but I remember at the assembly, there was exactly one item where there was a counted vote of the assembly that had no votes, where it was a unanimous statement of the assembly. And that was an item related to peace on the Korean Peninsula, I believe. So, and I think that was a Holy Spirit moment, because even those sorts of items can be deeply controversial. So as we look at today's conversation, we're looking at three areas. I've kind of identified three areas for our conversation today as we think about what this General Assembly has done in and around the life of the church. And this is kind of what the assembly does every time it meets. The first thing it does is to coordinate the life and ministry of the church at a national level. So it's kind of it in the same way that the session of a local congregation is supervising that work in the local space. The presbytery, when we gather in assembly, is supervising the work of the presbytery. The General Assembly does that for our national church. So there are some things that needed to be done just to establish the institution and keep it in order. And then the second thing that it does, it did this year, is to review church-wide structures and concerns. So kind of, we've set up these spaces for the church to function at a national level. And there are things that matter for the church at a broad level. And so the assembly took the time to review those and respond. And finally, the third area for action that I kind of identified for our conversation is that the assembly has identified some areas where local efforts can be coordinated in new and different ways to make them more effective and to link us up in new ways, to be a connectional church in a different way. So that's kind of how I've split up the conversation. This is completely my own shaping. I will probably leave out, and I know I will not get to every single item of business that the assembly considered that might come under one of these areas, or the general heading of what the church, of how the assembly actions affect the church. But this is my take on it, if you will. I will say I am not today mentioning anything about Book of Order amendments. That is all. The next two conversations are focusing on that. October 24th, coming up just in a few weeks, is our next one. And that one is going to focus on the rules of discipline, which there is a complete rewrite of the rules of discipline section of the Book of Order that is before the presbyteries for vote. And it is quite likely that the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta will be voting on that at our November meeting. So we want to make sure that there's some information out there about that. I will also let you know for October 24th, we will have a special guest for our conversations with the clerk, a member of the Rules of Discipline Task Force, who is very well known to our presbytery, Donna Wells. So I'm excited about having her back and being in conversation with her about this really important change that she was a big part of happening, and that is in response to a lot of the concerns and things that this presbytery has explored over the years. So that a preview of coming attractions. And then the last conversation, I think, is in January, anticipating voting on Book of Order amendments in February. So kind of to look at that first area of attention for GA action around coordinating the life and ministry of the church at a national level. I think the first place to start with thinking about that is what every assembly does, which is to elect a moderator or co-moderators. Historically, the election of the moderator indicates the spirit of the assembly that is to come. And there are many who have historically tried to read the tea leaves based on who was elected moderator to figure out what the assembly is going to do next. But that's less and less common now as we have moved away from some of the hot button issues that sparked really strong conversations in the life of the church. And I think it's brought on a new emphasis and understanding of the role of the moderator of the General Assembly as an embodied mark of the unity of the church. We have slightly moved away from a single body in that. We are now on, I think, our 5th consecutive assembly with co-moderators. So 16, 18, 20, maybe 4th consecutive assembly with co-moderators. I'm trying to count off the top of my head, but I believe, my sense is that the church has really embraced this model, rather than trying to put so much weight on a single individual to bear this forward, to elect two people who can share the leadership. And that is in and of itself a better recognition of how we are all called to share in the ministry that we have. This year's co-moderators are Siobhan Starling Lewis, who's a pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina at Memorial Presbyterian Church, and Ruth Santana Grace, who is the executive presbyter in Philadelphia Presbytery. They were elected on the first ballot. There were only two sets of candidates, and they served the church very well in the assembly. And we're hoping that they will be a part of a Presbytery meeting sometime next year for us. I mentioned earlier about the format of the assembly, where we had the first plenary was a hybrid meeting, and then with people gathered in person and online. Then 16 committee meetings were held in Louisville over the course of 2 weeks. It's a unique setup where the assembly, all the people never gathered in the same place at the same time. And that was I would say that's definitely a first in the life of the church. But they still gathered in person. So it was a really unique thing. The first floor of the Presbyterian Center in Louisville has been renovated into a wonderful new conference center space with full hybrid capabilities. And I actually was in a meeting there last week, and it's really well done, and it's designed. They did a wonderful job of designing it for the assembly, but also making it very useful for the long term. So after the 2 weeks of committee meetings, the plenaries for final action on business were held via Zoom. The challenge of holding Zoom meetings for a nationwide gathering is that you have folks across three or more time zones, definitely four time zones, but plus some others. So even if you start at 11 a.m., the person in Hawaii is going to be up very early. And if you finish at 11 p.m., the person on the East Coast is going to be up kind of late. So it was the scheduling was challenging, but it seemed to work. I mentioned earlier that one of the very first actions was to ratify the actions of the 224th General Assembly. So all of those are now official and done. But one of the last actions was actually to set the format and the plan for the 226th General Assembly in 2024. So the history has been that the assembly location is set 6 years in advance. So in 2018, the General Assembly agreed to have its 2024 meeting in Salt Lake City, Utah, and then COVID happened. So, and we know that the assembly will likely never look quite the same as it did in 2018. So the format, this year's assembly approved a format where the committee meetings will be held via Zoom prior to in-person plenary gatherings in Salt Lake City. The exact dates of this are yet to be determined, and the specific format is exactly how it's all going to link up, and whether the committees are all going to happen online at the same time, or if they're going to be spread out in some way. That's still a work in progress. The Committee on the Office of the General Assembly, on which I serve, is starting to look at the exact details of that, and actually we'll be setting that arrangement within the next couple months. So we'll know a little bit more, but probably by the end of the year. But the time in Salt Lake City is almost certain to be late June and early July of 2024. So it's going to kind of depend on where the committee meetings happen on the calendar. So those are kind of the formational pieces about getting the assembly together and making plans for its meeting format. Before I go on to some other coordination work at the national level, are there any questions? So I will move on then.
Well, I must say
Go ahead,
something.
Betty. Yeah.
I come at General Assembly a little differently because for the most part, I've been an observer over the years, many times being my own way to go. But commissioners have generally been more liberal when they come to a General Assembly. And because they see a wider view of the church, and not just in the actual meeting, but even in the halls where you can see all the different entities that are a part of who we are. But I am very concerned, and maybe you're not going to discuss that here, but I am very concerned that, and I watched the General Assembly this year, but I'm very concerned about what happened on the last day of the Assembly this year. That there is a move. I mean, the commissioners had originally decided that we would have task force to look at separation of the Office of the General Assembly and the Presbyterian Mission Agency. Those may not be quite the right names.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the last day, you had they changed it to a commission. And something tells me, from my experience, that something was going on, and a number of persons had to make contact in the last few days before that General Assembly ended for the majority of those commissions to change. And this is coming from my experience and from my heart and how I feel about what's going on at this General Assembly.
Thanks, Betty. So I appreciate your comment there, and I'm going to kind of ask us to take it and set it just to the side for a moment, because I'm going to talk in a minute about that particular action, and I want to make sure that those who didn't follow the Assembly super closely understand a little bit more about what we're talking about before we talk a lot about that. So if that's all right, is that okay, Betty?
Sure.
Great. But Betty's kind of alluded to some. I'm going to give you a couple of pieces and then get to what Betty was mentioning about, because the next thing I was going to talk about was to mention that the General Assembly, as part of its coordinating work for the national church, actually approves the budget for the national church. And so we had the Assembly approved a 2-year budget for the 3 key entities of the national church: the Presbyterian Mission Agency, the Office of the General Assembly, and the Administrative Services Group. Those 3, the budgets were for 2023 an $88 million budget, and for 2024 an $89 million budget. These budgets, where does the money come from, is a great question, and that's part of what all of this feeds into the conversation that Betty is alluding to, because I think I don't have the exact numbers, but there's about $12 to $13 million of that budget comes from per capita giving, which each session sends to the Presbytery, and the Presbytery sends to the General Assembly to support the work of the national church. And the rest of it comes from individual and other gifts, and from transfers from endowments. The per capita rates for this assembly, so to put this in context, in 2022, the per capita rate is $8.98. Then we look to 2023, and it jumps to $9.85. And interestingly, this is the first moment in a long time that in 2024, it actually goes down 5 cents to $9.80, just because of the way that the expenses are distributed out over those 2 years. So you'll see it. So those are coming along. The increase, it is a substantial increase. It's a net, but the reasoning that is put forward for the increase is that we are seeing smaller membership numbers. And so but it's very difficult to shrink the size of our national entities solely on that basis. Because there are certain things that no matter how small or large we are, we've got to keep doing, particularly on the ecclesial side of the budget that is primarily funded by per capita dollars. Other increases were related to mandates that came out of this assembly. I'll mention several things along the way about special committees that were formed. There weren't a ton of them, but each special committee has a cost. I think it's usually 1 to 2 cents per year of per capita. So you'll see so as the assembly does its work, they receive a daily report on the financial implications of their actions. And if you're interested, I can point you to the full budget. You can learn a whole lot more about it. But my guess is it's probably not going to be in that list of things you want to do as you hunker down during a storm. It's probably more likely to be a cure for insomnia. So one of the other big coordination tasks that happens on an annual basis, every time the assembly meets, is that it reviews the work plan for the key missional agency of the church, known as the Presbyterian Mission Agency. The Mission Agency is the group that runs the missional side of operations in Louisville, Kentucky, where our national offices are located. It also the Mission Agency also coordinates world mission as well. So there are somewhere between 200 and 250 folks who work in the Mission Agency at any given time. I may be overestimating. With all of the shifts around COVID, there have been changes in the sizes of the agencies. But in general, there's around that number. And so the assembly reviewed the plans for those folks for the next 2 years and said that, and gave them a roadmap for the work that is ahead. The mission work plan for 2023 and 2024 builds on the existing Matthew 25 initiative of the church, which I hope you're aware of in different ways. But the 3 key pieces of the Matthew 25 initiative are around congregational vitality, dismantling structural racism, and ending systemic poverty. Along with these 3 areas, the new mission work plan establishes a new space called the Center for Repair of Historical Harms, which is designed to help the church explore ways to respond to those historical harms, particularly around race and Native peoples. I think are kind of the 2 key areas that they are focusing on. And then they're also creating an Office of Innovation, Futuring, and Discernment to help the church look forward in new ways. In addition, the mission work plan calls for attention in 3 new areas that are not new areas of Matthew 25, of the Matthew 25 initiative, but kind of recognizing that there are 3 other ways that that living into a Matthew 25 vision engages the life of the church. And those are around climate change, militarism, and gender discrimination and heteropatriarchy. So the mission agency will be identifying ways that the work it's doing is engaging in those 3 areas. and trying to lift that up in the months and years ahead over the course of the work plan. So they are kind of living into this in a new way, and at the instruction of the General Assembly. So I mentioned that there are 3 entities at the national level: Presbyterian Mission Agency, the Office of the General Assembly, and the Administrative Services Group. Each one of those is led by a board or a committee. The Committee on the Office of the General Assembly met last week in Louisville. The Presbyterian Mission Agency Board met this week in Stony Point, New York. And I believe the Administrative Services Group, which is known as the Board of the Presbyterian Church, a corporation, I believe they meet this coming week. So these entities are meeting as we speak, quite literally, to engage the next steps in implementing the actions of the Assembly. And so the Mission Agency Board this week, I was reading this morning about how they've been taking the next steps in implementing the mission work plan and making sure that there is staff in place to begin that work. And so that kind of summarizes my coordination piece of what the General Assembly does and did. I want to pause again for any questions, noting that the next topic I'm going to get to is Betty's comment, and because it kind of it's the next step around the coordination work. So are there any questions? Yeah, Karen.
What were the 3 items that you indicated that they would be looking at for the whole church under the existing Matthew 25 initiative? Climate change, and then there were 2 others. What were those?
Oh, yeah. So just to be clear, they've recognized that these are kind of there are things that are happening in the mission agency that they want to that they're in different places that they want to link up better. So it's not really the whole church; it's across the mission agency.
Okay, right.
But it's climate change, militarism, and gender discrimination, and heteropatriarchy.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? So that kind of takes us to our next area around reviewing church-wide structures and concerns. And this, I've just mentioned how we've got these 3 agencies that are working at the national level, or 2 agencies and an entity that are working at a national level out of Louisville. And the 2 key agencies in Louisville are the Office of the General Assembly and the Presbyterian Mission Agency. The Office of the General Assembly is about 50 people who work in Louisville and in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at the Presbyterian Historical Society on ecclesial matters of the ecclesial ministries of the church, like archives, records, helping support decision-making processes and putting on the General Assembly. And I cannot say anything more about this topic without saying that I am a member of the Committee on the Office of the General Assembly, and so I bring a particular perspective to this. I'm trying my best in our conversation today to be balanced and equitable about this. I do have my personal opinions, but I hope you'll walk away not carrying those, but understanding what is before the church as this action is moving forward. So the Office of the General Assembly, I've mentioned. The other is the Presbyterian Mission Agency, which is the national staff who build programs and support ministries around particular missional priorities, like international mission co-workers, things like theology and worship, youth ministry, evangelism. When you hear about some new worshiping communities, when you hear about those sorts of efforts, those have historically happened in the mission agency. The first question that I think is important to ask is, why have they been separate? and understand a little bit about the history. I'm not going to try to give you a history of what was once called the Holy Horseshoe. If you ever want to know about the Holy Horseshoe, we'll have a cup of coffee or some other beverage and talk about it. But the OGA and PMA, as they are known, were kind of emerged. Nobody actually separated them, but they emerged as two separate entities about 10 years after reunion. They have different staff leaders and different staff structures. They have different priorities in their work. And in part, some of their priorities are I'd say that the mission agency's priorities are much more likely to change than the Office of the General Assembly's priorities. So it's OGA kind of is a static set of priorities to support the ecclesial life of the church. Mission agency is trying to be more responsive, has historically tried to be more responsive to missional needs. The two agencies have somewhat different internal cultures. If you talk to folks who worked there, they would describe different ways that the entities function. They have different funding streams. The Office of the General Assembly gets almost all of its funding from per capita. And the mission agency gets a small portion of its funding from per capita, but most of its funding comes from fundraising. If you've ever gotten a mailing from Louisville, direct mail, trying to get you to give to Presbyterian Disaster Assistance or the Presbyterian Giving Catalog, that's one of the ways that the mission agency raises money. They also raise money from churches, obviously, but that just give you a sense that those are the kinds of ways that they bring in funds. The Office of the General Assembly is historically a smaller agency. It's usually, it's been in the 40 to 70 or 75 employee range for most of its existence. The mission agency has historically been larger. Both entities are actually served by a single administrative entity. I've mentioned the Administrative Services Group, known as ASG. The employees are actually employed by the same company. Everybody who works for OGA and PMA gets paid by Presbyterian Church USA, a corporation. So that is the corporate entity that serves both of these entities, of the Office of the General Assembly and the mission agency. So the question then, after why are they separate? This assembly was asking the question, why would you bring them together? And the proposal to bring them together came from, it didn't come out of midair, it came from a special committee on financial sustainability. So the primary reason put forward for this was to build this unification process was to build a more secure funding stream for the ecclesial ministries of the church. So that there was, because per capita funding is trending down and missional giving is staying where it is and tending upward, it was putting a strain on the Office of the General Assembly finances if we are going to continue functioning at the national level as we have done since reunion in 1983. Additional reasons put forward is to streamline some operations and eliminate a few redundancies in staff. And I would put with that a reduction in the confusion. If you went to someone who has experience with the national church, but who is called Louisville for something, they probably would not be able to tell you whether they spoke to somebody in the Office of the General Assembly or in the mission agency. The average Presbyterian in the pews would not be able to make this distinction. Some of us can. I suspect several of us on this call can do that. But it is a confusing system and structure. Understanding how the funds work and I've been on the committee on the Office of the General Assembly for 6 years, and I am still learning how the funds are separated and how we supervise the budgets. And it often doesn't make a lot of sense. The goal being in all of this is simply to make national work more sustainable. That was put forward by the committee that proposed this and seemed to emerge over time in the assembly itself around this. And finally, the hope in bringing them together, and this is, I think this is a little bit of my own, but I definitely saw this in the committee's presentation, is to remove what seems to be a somewhat artificial separation between ecclesial operations and mission work. The work that we do when we gather for discernment, because of how we understand ourselves as Presbyterians, is just as much missional as when we go out and work around the world in the mission field. And there's much space in between those two. And so the argument has been that we're making an artificial separation between what sometimes is called two sides of the house. The Assembly, in its consideration of this proposal, Betty's alluded to some of this in her question. There was a lot of conversation and back and forth, and the issues that I heard in the Assembly's conversation were things like these. First of all, the question is now the time. Is this the right moment to bring these two agencies together? There was also a question of, do they need to be together at all? But that was, I sensed that question was not being asked. That question felt answered pretty early on in the conversation. The Assembly's the committee's discernment in particular felt like they were leaning toward unification as a good thing, and it got quickly down to timing and details. Details of how fast this should happen. Should it be immediate? Should it be 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10? What was the timetable we're looking at? Then there was a question of what is the role of race in this recommendation. There were really clear questions asked and never fully answered. I will be honest that recognizing that the heads of these two agencies are both African American, and is this some sort of attempt to undermine their leadership in some way? And my personal opinion is that is not what is being put forward by this, but I appreciated the conversation around that, and it was definitely a point of the Assembly's discernment. And the other question that Betty has alluded to as well is the question of how much authority should be given to the people who are charged to do the work. Are they being asked to put together a plan and bring it to the Assembly for action in a couple years? Or are they being asked to put together a plan, bring it to the Assembly for action, and take steps now to start implementing it? And so that was kind of the final piece of the question. And that was the distinction between a task force and a commission. So just to briefly summarize how that was really kind of where the most conversation happened around this issue at the Assembly. The special committee that brought this report suggested a commission that would be given authority to do this work and bring a final plan in 2 years' time. The Assembly committee that considered that special committee recommendation had a long debate over whether or not to bring a commission or a task force recommendation to the plenary. And the committee's recommendation, the Assembly committee's recommendation, came to the assembly, to the plenary, was for a task force. Then in plenary, the task force recommendation was amended. The recommendation to make a task force was amended back to a commission. So the recommendation started as a commission, it became a task force, and then it changed back to a commission. So we landed like this, that a commission was created to make a roadmap for the work and begin implementation. The final plan for the unified agency will come for approval in 2024 or 2026. I'm not clear which one it is. I think it's 2020. The text reads 2026, but I think there might be it's just not clear as to where that landed. And they will clarify that as part of their work on the commission. So the commission has the authority to make changes to the current structure if needed, and to make adjustments along the way. If for some reason the work that is currently happening gets in the way of unification in time. So the commission has not begun its work. It has not even been appointed. If this is something that you are curious about or want to devote a good bit of time in your life over the next 2 years to, I encourage you to apply for this commission. All of the special committees being created by the Assembly are currently open for applications, I think through October 15th. So please consider that. If you're interested, let me know, and I will happily send you a link to put your name in. So that's kind of what I wanted to get out there information-wise about the unification action that Betty alluded to earlier. Are there any questions about this, kind of understanding what it's trying to do? And I will try to answer them, and again, try my best to kind of answer from a answer in a clear way that doesn't that reflects as little as possible of my personal opinions and my special role in this issue as a member of the Committee on the Office of the General Assembly. So, yeah, Karen.
Could you give a pro and con answer? In other words, the people who are for this, what is their general statement? And for the people who would be against it, what is their general statement? So we can accurately
I think
go both sides of it.
Sure. Yeah. The pro, I think, is that that it does give the primary, and I'll say the pros of the commission, because that's really where, and Cheryl was a commissioner, so if you may want to feel free to jump in on this too. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there's something that you heard that I didn't, that I'm not reflecting here. I think the pros of a commission are that it will be able to move more quickly, and it would not be, if we hit any snags with this process, we don't have to wait until the Assembly meets in 2024 to resolve them, because the commission has the full authority of the Assembly to sort it through. I think the con of it is kind of the reverse of that, which is that the commission has the full authority of the Assembly to work it through, and maybe we need to, and maybe the voice of the whole Assembly needs to be heard, even if we hit a snag along the way. Yeah, Cheryl?
One thing I would say that I think relates, in my opinion, to all this is that, especially when we got to this topic and everybody was so mentally burned out already and kind of exhausted, is I felt that there was a real tension between protecting our beloved people in those jobs versus protecting our budget and our sustainability.
Hmm.
And I felt a tension there, and especially because I was watching a Facebook group about folks watching GLA online. And what are they doing to our people versus financially? And one of the things I would say in relationship to what I think I heard Betty say earlier is that I think the way we had the committees meet in person, and so we had group building there and built trust within our committees. But when we came back to the whole plenary, there was not that trust. And so I felt a lot of actions of some committees got totally re-discussed and re-argued. Like hopefully in a session at a church, your committees do the work and bring a recommendation. And then the session doesn't redo all the work of the committee. You trust that those members of your session have done the work, done the research, done the discussion. And so it doesn't need to happen again at session. Session should vote it up or down or make an amendment and not redo the work. But I felt there was a lot of redoing the work in the way General Assembly was set up this year. So that's just my opinion.
Thanks, Cheryl. That's helpful for me.
Right.
Helpful insight. Betty, any more comments you want to offer? I mean,
No comments, but I'm saying thank you for your explanation. And my feeling is an attenuated explanation, but that's okay. But I want just you to know that 2 of those major players came from the missional side. Okay? 2 on that special committee. Okay? And I know that you know that. I mean, at one point in their life, I'm saying. Now they're on the other side. Okay? And all of this is coming from my observation, and no one has told me anything. See, I'm a woman of who I am, and I know what it is that I feel and what I do. Okay? But anyway, it's okay.
No, Betty, thank you for, I really appreciate your your interested, educated, careful listening to this and the perspective that emerges from it. And I'm with you, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate our ability to kind of stand in a little bit different spaces on this, and with mutual respect and mutual forbearance, to use the Book of Orders comment. And I'm hopeful. I will, maybe where I would leave this is to say, it's my hope and prayer that the commission never has to use any of its special commission power. That would be a huge gift to the commission's work and to the whole church. That and just because you have power and authority does not mean that you must use it. I think that is something that I will walk into this with hope and prayer that they will find a way to mediate the disputes, misunderstandings, whatever they are, to build up the whole church without having to use that very special, very, very strong power and authority that I think I heard in your concern, Betty, but also I've heard in many other concerns along the way.
Okay, and I want to thank Cheryl Hartman for her comments as a commissioner as well.
Yes, thanks, Cheryl. I'm so glad you're on. I think we had 1 or 2 commissioners on the last call, and I was so grateful just to see them and know that you are here to correct me when I go astray in something I share. Any other comments or questions on this? I mean, I think this is probably the largest thing that the assembly did. So I want to make sure we have time, we understand it. So I'll move on to another kind of review of national work and kind of saying, what can we do differently, better? One of the things, and another thing that this assembly did was to create a special committee to rewrite the standing rules of the General Assembly. Now, I mentioned personal interest in the last item. I must mention a very strong personal interest in this item as well. This item came from the Committee on the Office of the General Assembly, and I will confess, I think it's the right term, that I was the primary writer of this item when in the committee's work. So, and I resourced this along the way, and I have been interim. I am one of the representatives from the Committee on the Office of the General Assembly to this committee, so I will most likely be serving on it. But this special committee is going to review the process of how the assembly meeting happens and look for ways to streamline and simplify the rules. We currently have about 60 pages of standing rules of the assembly. They were written and designed for an assembly that doesn't exist anymore. When everything was happening in person, when there was a very strong assumptions around very core issues to the life of the church and the identity of church leadership, and groups that were functioning in very adversarial ways. And the assembly itself was, I'd say there's a spectrum from adversarial to discerning, with deliberative in the middle. And the goal of any group that gathers via Robert's Rules is to be a deliberative body. Back in those days, it was a good bit more adversarial, and I hope we're moving more toward that discerning body where we seek together to find the will of Christ. And the rules were written for an adversarial assembly, and we need to move toward that discerning assembly. And that's so this committee will be an important part of kind of crafting what the assembly looks like for the next generation. We also, at this assembly, appointed a committee to write a new confession to add to the Book of Confessions. Based on, and Cheryl, maybe you can offer some insights based on your experience as a commissioner and your understanding of what this new confession might reflect on, because I wasn't quite able to decipher from the action taken what the focus should be. Based on your look, I'm not sure you know much more, but.
Well, I know that Reverend Barbie, who was my boss at that time, she has since left Oakhurst, was one on that committee and one of the resources for it. And I believe it's a confession primarily against the white supremacy and racism. Okay, yeah, that aligns with some of the two kind of pieces that I saw in some of the actions were about we're addressing white supremacy honestly from the North American context. We certainly have a wonderful resource in the Confession of Belhar from South Africa, but that is not clearly from the North American context. But so that's one. The other being kind of looking at theological anthropology and what does it mean to be human, and how does our humanity how is our theology of humanity reflected in our overall sense of belief. So that's kind of what I understood coming out of it, those two pieces. The committee will shape it in its own way, but that's what I heard and understood. Again, another special committee that was appointed is a task force on the theology and practice of ordination
including, and this is a quote, including commissioned ruling elders, as well as membership, church structure, accountability, and chartering. My reading of this is that it's a group that will start a response to ongoing concerns that the current approach to how we structure and govern the church leaves out some who are a part of the church, particularly thinking particularly about new worshiping communities, like where Francis serves, and how we can lift up those voices and bring them more fully into the life of the church. Along with this, the Assembly did take an interim action to ask the Office of the General Assembly to create national guidelines for chartering new worshiping communities. We do not have a national statement about how we charter congregations and what the requirements might be or what needs to be considered along the way. So folks in Louisville, the staff in Louisville were asked to create some guidance on that. Last piece in this review of national church work and is the report of the Survivors of Sexual Misconduct Task Force. A lot of this report kind of looked at some amendments, potential amendments to the Book of Order, which we'll talk about in January when we gather. But it also kind of, this committee was, this task force was looking at the gaps in the church's processes of discipline and response for sexual misconduct, and ways that we can be more faithful in our response to those who have been harmed in this, particularly by strengthening resources to support congregations when this sort of thing occurs. So that's the last item I have under that section of review of church-wide structures and concerns. Are there any questions on especially on these last 2 or 3 items about standing rules and confession, etc.? Cheryl.
During talking about the ordination bit, there was a little bit that came out of polity that you may be planning to get to later, with wanting to bring in Asheville. The Presbytery of Western North Carolina brought an amendment that we would accept any ordination from another denomination, and it was sent back that it was we did not accept that amendment. We voted that down, but recommended that a commission or somebody come up with a policy to work more with minority denomination, primarily minority denominations, so that those ordinations can transfer more fully, kind of like we do with the ELCA and the UCC. So to build more of those partnerships so we still maintain some of the quality of our ordination, and we don't say just somebody who grew up in a Baptist church that had no ordination standards could all of a sudden become a Presbyterian ordained pastor. But encourage that work to begin there.
Thanks, Cheryl. I think when I was reviewing items, I didn't look for this gathering at any of the Book of Order items, because, and then you're right, some of them got a response like that. That's a really helpful thing, where we're going to try to explore some alternatives to an amendment to the Book of Order to achieve similar ends. I know we've got. I'd like for us to finish up by 10:30, so I'm not going to rush us through, but I want to honor your time as well. But thankfully, my last section was short anyway. So the Assembly kind of also looks at areas where we can collaborate more, better, more effectively. One of them being the love or bane of every clerk of session's existence, the session annual statistical report that is filled out every January and February. There were a couple of changes approved to this. This is an incredibly important collaborative tool. It is the one place where we can know that we're going to learn about our congregations in a consistent way with as many reporting as possible. I think we get somewhere between 80 and 85% of our congregations complete the session annual statistical report in any particular year. And that's nationwide. I think Greater Atlanta, we're going to have more. But the changes this year are to age distribution of members, Christian education numbers, and financial reporting. So Karen, I see your hand. Yes.
Was there any discussion about counting online viewership? I mean, because, you know, we had a good almost a year where all we had was online. And so I counted Facebook and YouTube in one of my reports, which made Covenant look great. But my interim pastor questioned that. So last, let's see, that was 2 years ago report. So this last report, I counted half of Facebook and online, figuring that maybe that was closer to what was actually there. So, but was there any discussion about that?
There was no action taken. I think that has definitely been an ongoing conversation in national church circles. I think that the best response given has been that should be a local decision, because the nature of participation in worship via online circles will differ for each community. So some are much more engaged and others are not. So that there's not a plan to be consistent nationally. I would personally, as the clerk of the presbytery, I would encourage you to present it to session and say, this is what we're doing. Are you okay with it? That's what you're supposed to do anyway. It's not the clerk's report, it's the sessions report. Right. But then also to be consistent. Once you kind of identify a process, stick with it. Give it a couple, obviously, the last year or two have been up and down, but I would say, going forward, figure out something that works and stick with it.
Thanks.
So the next area for increased collaboration is attention to issues around congregations of color. There was a report to this assembly that from the Racial Equity Advisory Committee, I believe, that noted that 80% of congregations of color do not have installed pastoral leadership. 80% nationwide. And that I don't know the exact numbers in Greater Atlanta, but I would say that lines up with my experience in Atlanta and in other presbyteries. And so FACT was presented to the assembly with some recommendations to recognize that there are historic harms that have been done to racial ethnic congregations and to take some initial steps toward repair. Finally, another action would actually called on national entities to develop tools for congregations to explore and reflect upon their history and its impact on the lives of people of color, past and present. So to do kind of an internal, some might call it a race audit, some might call it just a history exercise, congregational history exercise, not just this is when the pastor was, this is when we put up the building, but this is where the resources came from that created the building. We had slave owners in our pews who funded the construction of our church building, and that's important to recognize. So the last thing I want to mention, just for coordinating, for national church coordination work, it was around immigration. There was an entire assembly committee devoted to immigration issues. I think the expectation was that there would be more business around this, but there was a good bit less. But the committee recognized that we have 2 staff in Louisville who are exclusively focused on immigration issues. One of them does education and advocacy work. The other is a full-time immigration attorney and works with presbyteries and congregations to assist in visa issues, most particularly with ministers, because we need we need that kind of intentional effort there. So the actions of the assembly were to create a network of legal resources around immigration, recognizing that we have people in our pews and in our offices who have a lot of information and resource on this. And lastly, that they passed a declaration that the Presbyterian Church USA is a sanctuary and accompaniment church. There's a particular definition that they have for that, which I encourage you to look for. And I will put the link to that in the chat so you can take a look at that if you are interested. So that's we have kind of, it feels like we may have run quickly through the last little bit, but I really, that was not the intent. And it's certainly, I don't think it was the impact either, because most of our content was front loaded in my presentation. So my outline, but are there any questions on this last section or any of these items as we draw this to a close? Well, I am so grateful that you would spend your Saturday morning with me in general, but especially around a very wonky and nerdy topic like the actions of the General Assembly. I love it personally. I think some of you do too, and it's great. It is a source of joy for me, not just because I enjoy the space that we create where we make these decisions, but because this really does give us shape and form to who we are as a church, and reminds us that we're not purely democratic, but we are not, we are never led and guided by a single person, but always doing this work together. And the General Assembly is the largest embodiment we have of that as a church. And it's an incredible experience. So mark your calendars for end of June, early July 2024. And wait, and when the flights become available, head out to Salt Lake City and be a part of it. So I am so grateful to have been with you today. Let us close with prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for these friends in faith who have gathered to learn more about how you are at work in our church, and to find ways that they can step into it and join us along the way. Guide all of our steps, oh God, that we might do your will, that we might follow your way and be faithful in all that we do, so that your love might be shown in new ways to our broken and weary world. Through Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen. Friends, go in peace. Have a wonderful Saturday.